If you have a savings account and an index fund and you are still watching your rent outpace everything you put away, this video is going to show you why, and it has nothing to do with how much you're saving. There is a variable in every financial decision that nobody in personal finance talks about, and the people who figured it out in their 30s didn't get richer because they saved more. They got richer because their money moved faster. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that means, and you will have a question in your head that changes every financial decision you make from here. Here is what that actually feels like for most people right now. You are putting money away every month. Real sacrifice, and your rent went up more this year than your savings grew. You are doing everything right and going backwards. And the thought underneath that, the one that wakes you up at 3 a.m., is not about index funds. It is about whether you are going to be able to give your kids a decent life, whether you can send them to college without destroying yourself, whether you can take them on a vacation without spending the whole trip checking your balance. That is what is actually at stake, not a better return rate. Whether the people who depend on you are going to be okay. The reason the standard script is failing you is not that you need to save more. It is that the script only ever taught you to ask one question about money. What does it return? Nobody taught you the prior question. How many times can it cycle in a year? Those are not the same question. And the difference between them is the difference between your savings account and the way a bank makes money on your deposit. Some of the people who solved this problem built income streams that cycle on their own without them showing up for each one. We will come back to that. Matthew had been doing everything right for 9 years. Consistent contributions, diversified portfolio, the whole thing. And then he read one sentence about how banks actually make money on his deposits, and he could not look at his savings account the same way again, not because the sentence was complicated, because it was obvious, and he had never once applied the same logic to his own money. This video follows the 4 decisions he made after that. Over $300 certification. $900 in event tickets he almost didn't buy, and a $15,000 check into something he couldn't explain to his friends. By the end, you will have the question he couldn't stop asking after that afternoon. The question that made his $300 outperform his entire portfolio in under 12 months. He never stopped investing in index funds. He just stopped thinking that was the whole game. The thing that broke Matthew's brain wasn't complicated. It was one sentence. And it took him about 4 minutes to read it. He was reading a basic article on personal finance one Saturday afternoon, the kind of thing you click on half out of habit. Somewhere in the middle, the writer mentioned fractional reserve banking. The mechanic is simple. When you deposit $10,000 into your savings account, the bank doesn't hold $10,000. It holds a fraction, maybe 1,000, and lends out the rest. $90,000 flows out against your $10,000 deposit. The same dollar doing 9 jobs simultaneously. Matthew put the article down and opened his savings app. His $10,000 was doing one job, once a year, at 2.1%. He had never thought about money as something that had a speed. He'd thought about it as something that had a rate. 6%, 7%, 8% if you got lucky with a good year. But rate and speed are not the same question. Rate tells you what a dollar earns. Speed tells you how many times it earns before the year ends. That's the thing the personal finance industry almost never talks about. Not because it's a secret, because optimizing for rate is something every brokerage and savings platform can sell you. Optimizing for speed requires thinking about where you put your money before you think about what it returns. Matthew did something most people don't do. He got out a spreadsheet. Not to run the return numbers he already knew. To answer a different question entirely. How many times does each dollar I own cycle in a year? The savings account, once. The index fund, once. The 401k contribution, once. Everything he owned financially was set to the same speed, the slowest possible rate of cycling. And he had never once thought to ask whether that speed was a choice. It was. And that was the problem. Matthew didn't have enough to buy real estate. He had funny $300 and one question he hadn't thought to ask before. What's the fastest this money can come back to me? He'd been passed over for a promotion twice in 18 months. Not because he wasn't competent, because the team lead slot required a project management certification his employer kept specifying in the job post. He'd always filed it under nice to have someday. He spent $300 on it in October. He passed in December. Went to his manager in January with the certificate and a specific ask, a $400 a month raise, which was 14% of his base, which he knew was within the band for the role. His manager said yes, $4,800 a year on a $1,300 outlay. And unlike the index fund, it didn't stop. The raise didn't expire. It compounded into every future raise, every 401k match calculation, every eventual negotiation at a new job. The cycle didn't close. It kept returning. He went back to the spreadsheet. His portfolio had returned $680 that year. The certification had returned $4,800. The certification hadn't just beaten the portfolio, it had lapped it. Now the honest caveat here, this was a one-time cycle. The loop closed when the raise landed. He couldn't do the certification twice. He couldn't reinvest the $1,300 and run the same trade again. So the question this raised was the obvious one. What does a cycle that keeps repeating look like? The people I've seen do this at scale have built things that cycle without needing to show up for each one at all. We'll come back to that too. The second experiment didn't look like an investment at all. It looked like $900 he probably shouldn't spend. Matthew spent that money on 2 industry events across the year. Not a conference in his field exactly. 2 events in adjacent spaces, product and growth roles, a half step outside where he sat. The kind of thing he would normally have dismissed as networking, which he'd always found awkward and generally useless. The first event was fine. He met some people, had some conversations, went home with a stack of business cards he never followed up on. Not a great return. The second event was different. He ended up in a side conversation with a VP of product at a fintech company in Chicago that was scaling fast. They talked for 40 minutes. He followed up the next week. There was a role 2 levels above where he currently sat. He interviewed. He got it. His salary went up 30% on the day he started. The $900 returned more in month 1 of the new job than his index fund had returned all year. He added it to the spreadsheet. Then he sat with what the spreadsheet was now showing him. Neither of these were financial instruments. The certification was a credential. The events were rooms. But they had cycled faster than anything with a ticker symbol that he owned. And they had done it because he had stopped asking what they returned and started asking how fast they could come back to him. The velocity question worked on rooms and credentials the same way it worked on capital. That was the thing he had missed for 9 years. 3 years after the certification, Matthew wrote a check for $15,000 into something he couldn't fully explain to his friends. He doubled it. Here's what they were actually doing. At another event, same pattern, Matthew met 2 guys who bought small local businesses, a dry cleaner, a landscaping company, a small e-commerce operation, not to run them, to improve them and sell them. They would come in, spend 60 to 90 days fixing the 1 or 2 things that were suppressing the valuation, then sell at a higher multiple. Revenue up, expenses down, story improved, buyer found. Then cycle the capital into the next one. They weren't building a business, they were cycling capital through businesses. The asset wasn't the company, the asset was the cycle. Matthew couldn't do what they did. He didn't have the time or the operating experience. But he could write a $15,000 check as a minority investor. They took it. He did nothing after that. 3 years later, his stake was worth $32,000. He hadn't managed anything, hadn't made any decisions, hadn't shown up for a single meeting. Because the people running it understood velocity at the level of an entire business. They were asking the same question Matthew had started asking 3 years earlier, just at a different scale. Same question, more capital, faster cycles, bigger outcome. That was the pattern. Matthew never stopped investing in index funds. He just stopped thinking that was the whole game. He still maxes his 401k. He still has the diversified portfolio. He still does the things the standard script says to do, because those things aren't wrong. They're just incomplete. They answer one question and ignore another. The question every piece of personal finance content teaches you to ask is, what does this return? That's the rate question. 6%, 8%, 12% in a good year. It's a useful question. It's just not the first question. The first question is, how many times can this cycle? A 6% annual return cycles once. A $1,300 certification that generates $4,800 a year cycles every year without redeployment. A $900 evening that leads to a 30% salary increase cycles from day 1 of the new job and doesn't stop. A $15,000 investment with people who understand that capital should move, not sit, Cycles multiple times across multiple businesses over several years. Same inputs, different velocity, different outcomes. Here's what I've been doing that's related to this. Not index funds and not a certification. Something built specifically for the velocity model, where the setup happens once and the cycle runs without me in the loop for each one. If that framing interests you, the link is in the description. Worth a look. The NPC version of this story is still going. Still at the same job, maybe with a slightly better return rate in a slightly better fund, watching the numbers go up slowly while the cost of living goes up faster. Doing everything right, going nowhere. The thing that changed for Matthew wasn't ambition. He already had that. It wasn't discipline. He already had that too. It was one question, asked before every financial decision, every place he put time or money or attention. How many times can this cycle, and how fast? That's the question. You've got it now. What you do with it is the next part.